I never thought my life would turn into the kind of story you hear whispered at dinner parties or see dramatized in true crime documentaries. But here I am, sitting in front of you, ready to share something that changed everything I thought I knew about trust, family, and the walls we build around ourselves. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 32 years I lived what I considered a perfectly normal, comfortable life in a modest 2-story house on Maple Drive in suburban Connecticut. The kind of house with white picket fencing, a front porch with hanging baskets of petunias, and neighbors who waved every morning as they retrieved their newspapers. My husband, David, was a software engineer who worked from home 3 days a week, and we had 2 beautiful children, Emma, who was 7, and little Jacob, who had just turned 4. On the surface, everything looked picture-perfect, like one of those family portraits you see in furniture store displays, all smiles and coordinated outfits. But as I'm about to tell you, the most terrifying secrets aren't always hidden in dark alleys or abandoned warehouses. Sometimes they're concealed in the most familiar places. In the basement you walk past every day, in the locked drawer you've been told not to open, in the smile of someone you've shared a bed with for over a decade. It started on a Tuesday morning in late September, one of those crisp autumn days when the air smells like fallen leaves and possibility. I remember the date exactly because it was our anniversary, 12 years since David and I had stood at a small chapel in Vermont and promised to love each other through everything life would throw at us. I had taken the day off from my job as an elementary school teacher, planning to surprise David with his favorite lunch and maybe sneak away for a romantic afternoon while the kids were at school. The house was quiet in that particular way. It only gets during weekday mornings, with sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows and the distant sound of our neighbor's lawnmower creating a peaceful backdrop. I was in the kitchen preparing homemade pasta, David's absolute favorite, humming along to an old jazz record he had gotten me for my birthday, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire world was about to implode in the most unexpected way imaginable. David had gone out earlier, mentioning something about picking up a part for his computer from a store across town, and I expected him back around noon. I had maybe an hour to finish cooking, set the table with our good china, and change into the dress I knew he loved, the blue one that brought out my eyes. That's when I heard it. A strange buzzing sound coming from upstairs, rhythmic and persistent, like a phone vibrating against a hard surface. At first I ignored it, thinking it was probably just my own phone that I'd left somewhere. But the sound continued, growing almost insistent in its repetition. I wiped my hands on my apron and climbed the stairs, following the noise to our bedroom. The buzzing was coming from David's nightstand, from the drawer he always kept locked, the one he said contained important work documents and some old family heirlooms that were too valuable to leave unsecured. I'd never questioned it before because everyone deserves privacy, right? Everyone has that one drawer or box or corner of their life they keep to themselves, and I'd always respected that boundary. But the buzzing wouldn't stop, and something in my gut, that primal instinct we all have but often ignore, told me that maybe, just this once, I should look inside. I know what you're thinking, that I should have just waited for David to come home, that I should have respected his privacy the way I always had, but there was something about that persistent buzzing that felt almost like a warning, like the universe was trying to tell me something I needed to know. I went to David's home office, a small converted bedroom where he spent most of his working hours, and I started searching for a key. I felt guilty, my hands actually shaking as I opened desk drawers and rifled through papers, feeling like a criminal in my own home. It took me almost 20 minutes of searching before I found it, a small brass key taped to the underside of his keyboard tray, hidden in plain sight in that clever way people do when they want to keep something secure but accessible. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as I walked back to our bedroom, that key clutched in my sweaty palm, and I remember pausing at the doorway, giving myself one last chance to turn back, to choose ignorance over knowledge. But I didn't turn back. I crossed that room, inserted that key into the lock, and turned it with a soft click that seemed to echo through the silence of our empty house. The drawer slid open easily, and inside I found 3 phones. Not one, but 3 separate smartphones, all buzzing and lighting up with notifications. 3 phones that I had never seen before, that David had never mentioned, that had been hidden away in this locked drawer for God knows how long. My first thought was maybe work-related. Maybe he needed multiple devices for different clients or projects, something technical that I wouldn't understand because software engineering was his world, not mine. But when I picked up the first phone, a sleek black iPhone with a cracked screen protector, and looked at the notifications lighting up the lock screen, I felt my stomach drop in a way I'd never experienced before. Messages from women, dozens of them, with names I didn't recognize, and profile pictures that showed faces I'd never seen. "Can't wait to see you tonight," one message read. "Last night was incredible," said another. "When is your wife going on her next trip?" "I miss you," read a third, and that particular message made my knees go weak, and I had to sit down on the edge of our bed, the bed David and I had picked out together when we first bought this house, the bed where we'd conceived both our children, the bed where I'd believed we shared everything. I want to pause here and tell you something important, because if you're watching this and you've ever had that moment where your reality suddenly shifts, where everything you believed about your life gets called into question, you'll understand what I'm about to say. There's a specific kind of pain that comes from betrayal, not the sharp, acute pain of a sudden injury, but a deep, spreading ache that starts in your chest and radiates outward until it feels like every cell in your body is screaming. That's what I felt sitting on that bed, holding evidence of my husband's infidelity in my trembling hands. But what came next was so much worse than simple cheating, so much darker than I could have possibly imagined. Because as I unlocked that first phone, David was predictable enough to use Emma's birthday as the passcode. I discovered that the messages weren't just about affairs. They were about something else entirely, something that made the infidelity seem almost insignificant by comparison. The conversations referenced money, large amounts of money, transactions and deliveries, and coded language that even in my shock I recognized as deeply wrong, deeply illegal. I grabbed the second phone with shaking hands, this one a Samsung with a bright red case, and forced myself to unlock it using the same passcode, which incredibly worked. This phone contained different messages, different contacts, but the same disturbing pattern. References to shipments, to packages, to meeting locations and drop-off times. There were photos too, pictures I had to zoom in on to understand. Images of what looked like pharmaceutical pills in clear plastic bags, stacks of cash rubber-banded together, and screenshots of cryptocurrency transactions with values that made my eyes water. The third phone, an older iPhone model with a severely cracked screen, contained the most disturbing content of all: detailed spreadsheets of names, addresses, amounts, and dates, organized with the same meticulous attention to detail that David brought to every aspect of his life. This wasn't some impulsive mistake or a brief lapse in judgment. This was systematic, organized, long-term, and looking at the dates on some of these messages, it had been going on for at least 5 years, possibly longer. I sat there on our bed for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes. My mind racing through memories and moments, re-examining every late-night work session, every business trip, every time David had seemed distant or preoccupied. How many lies had I accepted as truth? How many times had I dismissed my own intuition because I trusted him, because I loved him, because questioning your spouse feels like betraying the foundation of your marriage? I thought about our children downstairs in their bedrooms, decorated with characters from their favorite movies, filled with toys and books and innocence, and I felt a rage building inside me that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not just rage at David's betrayal, though that was certainly there, but rage at myself for being so blind, so trusting, so willingly ignorant of what was happening in my own home. I heard David's car pull into the driveway at that moment, the familiar sound of his engine cutting off, his car door slamming shut, and I knew I had maybe 60 seconds before he walked through that front door, expecting to find his loving wife preparing an anniversary celebration. What would you do in that moment? Would you confront him immediately, phones in hand, demanding explanations and truth? Would you play it cool, pretend you'd seen nothing, and gather more evidence before making your move? Would you call the police right then and there, consequences be damned? I made a decision in those 60 seconds that I still question to this day. I took photos of everything on my own phone, every message, every spreadsheet, every incriminating image, working as fast as my shaking hands would allow. I could hear David's footsteps on the front porch, his keys jingling as he searched for the right one, and I was photographing frantically, barely taking time to aim properly, just capturing everything I could. I heard the front door open and his voice calling out, "Sarah, I'm home. Something smells amazing." In that cheerful, loving tone he always used, the same voice that had whispered sweet things in my ear just that morning before he left, the same voice that had read bedtime stories to our children the night before, and I felt bile rise in my throat at the sheer audacity of his normalcy, his ability to compartmentalize and lie with such ease. I locked all 3 phones, replaced them in the drawer exactly as I'd found them, closed and locked it, and then, in what might have been the most difficult performance of my entire life, I forced myself to smile as I walked down those stairs to greet my husband on our anniversary. "Hi, honey," I said, and I'm still amazed at how steady my voice sounded, how I managed to lean in and accept his kiss on the cheek without flinching, without screaming, without breaking down completely. He was holding flowers, a beautiful bouquet of roses and lilies, my favorites, and he had that boyish grin on his face that I'd fallen in love with 13 years ago when we first met at a mutual friend's party. "Happy anniversary," he said, pulling me into a hug that I had to force myself not to recoil from. And I hugged him back, breathing in his familiar cologne, feeling the solidity of his body against mine, and wondering how this man, the father of my children, my partner, my supposed best friend, had become such a complete stranger. We ate the pasta I'd prepared, sitting at our dining room table with candles flickering between us, and David talked about his day, about the traffic on the way to the computer store, about a funny interaction he'd had with the clerk, and every word out of his mouth felt like another layer of deception, another brick in the wall he'd built between us. I played my part perfectly, laughing at his jokes, asking follow-up questions, acting like everything was fine, like I hadn't just discovered evidence of crimes that could send him to prison for years, like our entire marriage wasn't built on a foundation of lies. I suggested we open a bottle of wine, one of the expensive bottles we'd been saving for a special occasion, because I needed something to take the edge off this nightmare while I figured out my next move. David was delighted, commenting on how romantic and thoughtful I was being, and I watched him pour the wine, watched him toast to our future together, watched him smile at me with what seemed like genuine affection, and I realized with horrible clarity that I had no idea who this person really was. After lunch, David suggested we spend the afternoon together, maybe take a walk in the park or watch a movie, but I told him I was feeling a headache coming on, probably from the wine, and I needed to lie down for a bit. He was immediately concerned, asking if I needed anything, offering to get me medication, being the attentive, caring husband he'd always appeared to be, and I thanked him and went upstairs, closing our bedroom door and locking it behind me. I spent the next 2 hours lying on that bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of shock, anger, fear, and indecision. What was I supposed to do with this information? I couldn't just pretend I hadn't seen it, couldn't go back to the ignorant bliss of yesterday morning. But confronting David directly felt dangerous in a way I couldn't quite articulate, like I'd be backing a cornered animal into a position where anything might happen. I thought about our children, about Emma's upcoming school play that she was so excited about Jacob's birthday party we were planning for next month, and I felt trapped between protecting them and exposing them to a truth that would shatter their world as completely as it had shattered mine. I pulled out my phone and looked through the photos I'd taken, forcing myself to really examine them now, to understand the full scope of what David had been involved in. The messages made it clear he wasn't just using drugs, he was distributing them, and on what appeared to be a substantial scale. The financial records showed transactions totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more, money that certainly wasn't reflected in our joint bank accounts or the modest lifestyle we maintained. Where was that money going? Was there a secret account somewhere? Was he saving it for some future plan that didn't include me? The more I looked, the more questions arose, and each answer I could imagine was worse than the last. Some of the messages referenced a partner named Marcus, someone who seemed to be deeply involved in whatever operation David was running. There were also references to locations, warehouses, storage units, meeting points, an entire infrastructure that had been operating right under my nose while I taught children their multiplication tables and attended PTA meetings. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our bedroom, I heard David downstairs making dinner for the kids who had arrived home from school while I'd been upstairs processing my discovery. I could hear Emma's excited voice telling him about her day, about the gold star she'd gotten on her spelling test, and Jacob's higher-pitched chatter about the dinosaur he'd made from clay in art class. Normal sounds, everyday moments, the soundtrack of a family life that now felt like an elaborate stage production, artificial and constructed rather than real and authentic. I forced myself to go downstairs, to continue the charade, because I still didn't know what else to do. David had made spaghetti with meatballs, the kids' favorite, and we all sat around the dinner table like we had hundreds of times before, and I pushed food around my plate, while Emma told us about her upcoming school play, where she'd gotten the part of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, and I smiled and congratulated her, and felt like I was watching this scene from outside my own body. After dinner, after the kids were bathed and tucked into bed with their bedtime stories, David suggested we watch something together, cuddle on the couch like we often did in the evenings. I agreed because I still didn't know what else to do, still hadn't formulated a plan, still felt paralyzed by the enormity of what I'd discovered. We sat on that couch, David's arm around my shoulders, watching some comedy that he'd picked, and I barely registered what was happening on screen because my mind was elsewhere, racing through possibilities and scenarios. Should I contact a lawyer first? Should I go to the police? Should I confront him privately and demand answers? Should I take the kids and leave immediately? Every option seemed fraught with complications and dangers I couldn't fully anticipate. I thought about the life we'd built together, this house we'd purchased 8 years ago, the garden we'd planted together, the memories embedded in every room, and I felt grief wash over me for the loss of something I'd believed was real, but apparently never was. That night, lying in bed next to David while he slept peacefully, his breathing deep and regular, I stared at the ceiling and made a decision that would change everything that followed. I would investigate further before making any moves, gather as much evidence as possible, understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before I acted. It felt dangerous, keeping this secret, continuing to pretend, but it also felt necessary. Like I needed to protect myself and my children by being fully informed before I destroyed our lives as we knew them. I waited until David's breathing had been steady for at least 30 minutes, ensuring he was deeply asleep, before I carefully slid out of bed, retrieved the key from his office where I'd replaced it earlier, and made my way back to that locked drawer. This time, I took the phones to the guest bathroom at the far end of the hall, locked the door, and spent the next 3 hours reading through messages, examining photos, studying spreadsheets, building a comprehensive picture of my husband's secret life. What I discovered was worse than I'd initially understood. David wasn't just a small-time dealer or casual distributor. He was running a sophisticated operation that involved multiple suppliers, numerous clients, and a distribution network that seemed to span several states. The messages revealed a side of him I'd never seen, calculating, ruthless, and completely devoid of the moral compass I'd believed he possessed. There were conversations about people who owed money, discussions of teaching lessons to those who didn't pay on time, references to threats and intimidation that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just illegal, it was dangerous, the kind of dangerous that I realized might explain some things I'd dismissed before, like the time 2 years ago when we'd come home to find our back door slightly ajar. Nothing missing, but a sense that someone had been in our house, or the strange car that had sat on our street for 3 days last summer, the driver just watching our house for hours at a time before finally disappearing. I photographed everything systematically this time, organizing the evidence in my mind into categories: financial records, communications with suppliers, communications with clients, logistics and locations, threats and violent references. By the time I finished, it was nearly 3 in the morning, and I felt exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, drained emotionally and mentally by the weight of what I now knew. I crept back to the bedroom, replaced the phones and relocked the drawer, and climbed carefully back into bed, where David stirred slightly and reached for me in his sleep, pulling me against him in a gesture that had once made me feel safe and loved, but now made me want to scream. I lay there awake for the remaining few hours until dawn, listening to my husband's peaceful breathing and wondering how someone could live such a compartmentalized existence, how he could kiss his children goodnight and then go downstairs to arrange drug deals and threaten people who crossed him. The next morning, Wednesday, I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, claiming a stomach bug that wouldn't let me stray far from the bathroom. I dropped the kids at school, came home, and while David was on a work call in his office, I started my own investigation, searching through the house for anything else he might have hidden. I went through every drawer, every closet, every box in the attic and the basement, working quickly but thoroughly whenever David was occupied with work or errands. What I found over the next few days painted an even more disturbing picture. A secret burner laptop hidden inside an old suitcase in the back of the garage, cash hidden in various locations around the house totaling over $30,000, a second key to a storage unit I didn't know we had, and most chilling of all, a small handgun hidden in the back of David's closet in a shoebox labeled old running shoes. I had never known David to own a gun, had never even heard him express interest in having one. We'd talked about gun safety after the kids were born, agreeing that we didn't want weapons in the house where children lived, that the risks outweighed any potential benefits. Yet here was this gun, fully loaded, hidden where I'd never have found it if I hadn't been specifically looking. I didn't touch it beyond verifying what it was, terrified of leaving fingerprints or evidence that I'd been snooping, but I photographed it carefully, noting its location and the way it was concealed. That discovery elevated everything to a new level of seriousness in my mind. This wasn't just white-collar crime or victimless drug distribution. This was the kind of operation where people kept loaded weapons within easy reach, where violence was apparently a real possibility, where my children and I might actually be in physical danger. I found the storage unit key hanging on a hook in the garage, labeled simply S4 in David's handwriting, and after checking the address on the keychain, I realized it was at a facility about 15 minutes from our house, a place I drove past regularly without ever giving it a second thought. I waited until Friday, when David mentioned he had a full day of meetings and wouldn't be home until evening, and after dropping the kids at school, I drove to that storage facility with my heart pounding so hard I thought I might be sick. The unit was in a back corner of the facility, away from the main office and the more trafficked areas, and when I unlocked it and rolled up the door, I found myself looking at something out of a movie. Shelves lined with boxes, a small desk with a computer, filing cabinets, and most alarmingly, several large plastic containers that, when I worked up the courage to open them, contained what I assumed were drugs in various forms, pills, powders, things I couldn't identify but knew immediately were deeply illegal. I stood in that storage unit, the metal door rolled up behind me, letting in cold morning air, and I felt the last remnants of my denial crumble away completely. This was real, horrifyingly real, and I was standing in the middle of what was probably enough evidence to send David away for decades. I took photos of everything, every angle, every container, every document I could find, working quickly because I didn't know who else had keys to this place or when someone might show up unexpectedly. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone steady, and I kept having to stop and breathe deeply to prevent myself from having a full panic attack. There were ledgers in the filing cabinet, handwritten records that matched the digital ones I'd seen on the phones, showing a systematic operation that had apparently been running for at least 6 years, possibly longer, predating the birth of our younger child, continuing through all the normal family milestones we'd celebrated together. I left that storage unit after about 45 minutes, carefully rolling down the door and making sure I locked it exactly as I'd found it. And I drove home in a daze, barely paying attention to the road. my mind overwhelmed with the implications of everything I'd discovered. When I got home, I sat in my car in our driveway for almost 20 minutes, staring at our house. This place that had represented safety and family and home. And I felt completely unmoored from reality, like I'd woken up in some alternate dimension where nothing was as it seemed. I thought about confronting David that evening, laying out all the evidence and demanding explanations, but I kept coming back to that gun hidden in his closet, to the violent references in his messages, to the fact that I had no idea what he might do if backed into a corner. My husband, the man I'd trusted with my life and the lives of our children, had become someone I feared, someone capable of things I couldn't fully comprehend. Instead of confronting him, I called my sister, Jennifer, who lived about 2 hours away in Boston. Jennifer was a corporate lawyer, smart and practical, and someone I'd always turn to when I needed level-headed advice. I told her I needed to talk about something serious, something I couldn't discuss over the phone, and could she possibly drive down that weekend when David would be taking the kids to his mother's house for their regular monthly visit? She agreed immediately, hearing something in my voice that told her this wasn't a casual request, and I spent the rest of that Friday and the weekend preparing for her arrival, organizing all the evidence I'd gathered on a secure cloud drive, writing down everything I'd discovered in chronological order so I wouldn't forget any details. David seemed completely normal that entire weekend, showing no signs that he suspected anything, no indication that he'd noticed I'd been through his things or visited his storage unit. We had dinner together Friday night. He took the kids to his mother's on Saturday morning as planned, and he came home Saturday evening, tired but cheerful, completely at ease, the performance of normalcy so convincing I might have believed it myself if I didn't know better. Jennifer arrived Sunday morning, right after David had left to pick up the kids from his mother's house, and I had maybe 3 hours to tell her everything before they all returned. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd had that anniversary lunch with David just days earlier, and I showed her everything, the photos, the messages, the financial records, the evidence from the storage unit, all of it. I watched my sister's face transform from concerned to shocked to horrified as she absorbed the full scope of what I'd discovered, and when I finished, she sat back in her chair, ran her hands through her hair, and said something I'll never forget. "Sarah, you need to understand that you're married to a criminal, a serious criminal, and everything you do from this point forward needs to be calculated to protect yourself and your children. Because if this comes out, and it will come out, eventually you could lose everything, your house, your savings, possibly even your kids if anyone suggests you knew about this and didn't report it. That possibility hadn't even occurred to me, that I might be seen as complicit, that my ignorance might not be believed, that the fact that I'd discovered this and hadn't immediately gone to the police might be used against me." Jennifer explained that spouses of criminals often face suspicion and investigation themselves, that assets are typically seized in drug cases, that I needed to be very strategic about how I handled this to ensure I didn't end up losing my home and my children's financial security. She recommended I contact a criminal defense attorney first, someone who could advise me on how to protect myself legally before I went to the police. She also suggested I start moving money from our joint accounts into accounts in my name only, not taking so much that David would notice, but enough that I'd have resources if things went badly. It all felt so calculated and cold, so far removed from the emotional devastation I was experiencing, but I understood the practical necessity of what she was suggesting. Over the next 2 weeks, I implemented Jennifer's advice methodically. I consulted with a criminal defense attorney who came highly recommended, explaining my situation under attorney-client privilege and getting his guidance on the best way to proceed. I started moving money slowly and carefully, a few hundred here, 1,000 there, always with plausible explanations if David noticed, Christmas shopping, home repairs, gifts for the kids. I made copies of all our important documents, birth certificates, marriage license, house deed, financial records, storing them at Jennifer's house in Boston where David would never think to look. I researched domestic violence shelters and safe houses, Not because David had ever been physically violent, but because I didn't know what he might do when confronted, and I wanted to know where I could take the kids if we needed to leave quickly. Through all of this, I maintained the facade of normal married life, making dinner, doing laundry, helping with homework, attending Emma's school play where she was wonderful as Dorothy, celebrating Jacob's birthday with a party at the local pizza place, all while knowing that I was systematically preparing to blow up our entire existence. The hardest part wasn't the investigation or the preparation. It was maintaining my composure around David, pretending I didn't know, pretending everything was fine when every cell in my body wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to ask how he could do this to us. There were moments when I almost broke, like when he came home one evening with flowers for no reason, just because he'd seen them and thought of me, or when I caught him playing with the kids in the backyard, building a fort together and laughing, and he looked so much like the man I'd fallen in love with that I had to excuse myself and cry in the bathroom until I could compose myself again. I thought about the David I'd married, the kind engineering student who'd helped me study for my teaching exams, who'd held my hand through 2 difficult pregnancies, who'd stayed up all night when Emma had croup as a baby, and I couldn't reconcile that person with the criminal I'd discovered him to be. Were they the same person? Had he changed, or had I simply never really known him? Had there always been this dark side lurking beneath the surface, just waiting for the right circumstances to emerge? The attorney I'd consulted advised me that when I was ready to go to the police, I should do it strategically, choosing a time when I could ensure my children were safe and when I had all my evidence organized and ready to present. He warned me that once I made that call, everything would move very quickly, that David would likely be arrested, possibly at our home, that our lives would become a media spectacle if the case was significant enough, that I needed to be emotionally and practically prepared for the fallout. He helped me understand that I was a victim in this situation, that I had no legal obligation to report my spouse's crimes immediately upon discovering them, that the time I'd spent gathering evidence and protecting my assets would be seen as reasonable self-preservation by most people. But he also warned me not to wait too long, not to let months pass, because that could indeed start to look like complicity or cooperation with David's activities. It was early December, about 6 weeks after my initial discovery, when I finally decided I couldn't wait any longer. The weight of the secret was crushing me, affecting my ability to function, causing me to lose weight and sleep, making me short-tempered with my children in ways that weren't fair to them. I'd reached out to David's mother, Margaret, whom I'd always had a good relationship with, and asked if the kids could stay with her for a few days, claiming I wanted to surprise David with a romantic getaway for the holidays. She was delighted, agreeing immediately, and I arranged to drop Emma and Jacob at her house on a Friday afternoon, telling them they were going to have a fun weekend with Grandma while Mommy and Daddy took a little trip. Emma was excited, but Jacob, who was more sensitive and intuitive, seemed to sense something was wrong, clinging to me when I tried to leave and asking me multiple times if everything was okay. I held him tight, breathing in the little boy smell of his hair, and I promised him everything would be fine. A lie I hated myself for telling, but one I felt was necessary to protect him from what was coming. That evening, with the kids safely at Margaret's house 2 hours away, I told David I needed to talk to him about something important, something I'd discovered that we needed to discuss. I'd thought carefully about how to approach this conversation, deciding ultimately that I owed it to the years we'd spent together, to the life we'd built, to at least give him the opportunity to explain himself before I involved the authorities. We sat in our living room, the same room where we'd celebrated Christmases and birthdays, where we'd watched our children take their first steps, where we'd planned our future together. And I looked at my husband, really looked at him, trying to find some hint of the truth in his familiar features. "David," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I know about the phones. I know about the storage unit. I know about the drugs and the money and everything you've been hiding. I know about all of it, and I need you to tell me the truth, right now, about what you've been doing and why." The expression that crossed David's face in that moment was something I'll never forget: shock, fear, anger, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Maybe resignation or relief that he no longer had to maintain the pretense. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at me with this unreadable expression, and I could almost see him calculating, trying to figure out how much I knew, what I had evidence of, what I might be bluffing about. Then he did something I didn't expect. He started to cry, not dramatic sobbing, but quiet tears that rolled down his cheeks as he dropped his face into his hands. "How did you find out?" he asked finally, his voice muffled by his hands. And I told him about the phones buzzing on our anniversary, about everything I'd discovered since then, leaving out some details about the evidence I'd gathered and the preparations I'd made, not wanting to tip my hand completely. What followed was a conversation that lasted hours, David telling me a story I couldn't have imagined about how it had started innocently enough 8 years ago, before Jacob was born, when a college friend had reached out asking if David could help with some tech consulting for what the friend claimed was a cryptocurrency startup. The money had been good, really good, and David had rationalized it as a victimless crime, helping people coordinate transactions, never touching the actual drugs himself, just providing technical infrastructure and logistics support. But over time, he'd gotten more involved, more invested, moving from technical support to active participation, and by the time he realized how deep he was, he felt trapped, unable to extricate himself without serious consequences. He talked about the money, how it had been addictive in a way he hadn't anticipated, how the modest life we lived publicly was sustained by this hidden income, how he'd been planning to make one big final score and then disappear from the business entirely, start fresh somewhere new, possibly even move our family to another state where we could begin again. I listened to all of this with a growing sense of horror and disbelief, not just at what he'd done, but at his ability to rationalize it, to frame it as something that had happened to him rather than something he'd actively chosen to do, repeatedly over the course of years. I asked him about the gun, about the violent messages I'd seen, and he insisted he'd never actually hurt anyone, that the gun was just for protection because the people he dealt with were dangerous, that the threatening messages were just business tactics to ensure people paid what they owed. He insisted he'd kept all of this completely separate from our family life, that he'd been careful to never bring that world into our home, that he'd done it all to provide for us, to give us a better life than his single income as a software engineer could have provided. And maybe if he'd told me this years ago, when he first got involved, before the lies had compounded and multiplied, before he'd built this entire secret life, maybe I could have found a way to understand or forgive or work through it together. But sitting there, listening to him try to justify 8 years of deception, 8 years of exposing our family to danger I hadn't even known about, 8 years of making me complicit through my ignorance, I felt nothing but a cold, hard anger. "Where are the kids?" David asked suddenly, seeming to realize for the first time that the house was unusually quiet. And I told him they were at his mother's house, that I'd wanted to have this conversation without them overhearing, without traumatizing them with things they shouldn't have to know about their father. He seemed relieved by this, nodding, saying that was probably wise, and then he asked what I was going to do with the information I'd discovered. I told him the truth, that I'd already consulted with an attorney, that I'd gathered extensive evidence, that I planned to go to the police because I couldn't live this lie anymore, couldn't risk our children being exposed to the danger of his lifestyle, couldn't be complicit in crimes that hurt people and destroyed communities. The relief on his face vanished, replaced by panic and then anger. "You can't do that," he said, his voice rising for the first time in our conversation. "Do you have any idea what will happen to us? They'll take the house, Sarah. They'll seize our assets. You'll lose everything. The kids will grow up with a father in prison. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about what you're destroying?" I told him I'd thought about little else for 6 weeks, that I'd considered every angle and every consequence, and that despite all of it, I couldn't see any other path forward that I could live with. I told him that what he'd done was unforgivable. Not just the criminal activity, but the lies, the deception, the way he'd made me an unwitting accomplice to his crimes, the way he'd put our children at risk without giving me any say in the matter. I told him that the David I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my life, no longer existed if he ever had, and that I couldn't continue to be married to the stranger sitting across from me. I told him I wanted a divorce, that I'd already consulted with a divorce attorney in addition to the criminal defense lawyer, that I would do everything in my power to protect myself and our children from the legal and financial fallout of his choices. Throughout all of this, David's expression kept shifting between anger and pleading, and he begged me to reconsider, promised he would stop immediately, swore he would cooperate with authorities, do whatever it took to make things right, if I would just give him a chance to prove he could change. But I'd thought about this too, about whether someone who'd lied so successfully for so long could ever truly be trusted again, about whether a marriage could survive this kind of fundamental betrayal. And I knew in my heart that we were already over, that this conversation was just the formality of acknowledging what his actions had already destroyed. I stood up from the couch, prepared to leave, to drive to Jennifer's house in Boston, where I'd planned to spend the night before going to the police in the morning. But David stood too, moving to block the doorway, and for the first time since this all started, I felt genuine fear. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice low and hard in a way I'd never heard before. "We're going to figure this out together. You're not destroying our family." I could see the desperation in his eyes, the realization that everything he'd built, both the legitimate family life and the criminal enterprise, was crumbling, and I remembered the gun in his closet, wondered if he was thinking about it too, if he was calculating just how far he was willing to go to protect his secrets. I tried to keep my voice calm, tried not to show the fear that was making my heart race and my hands shake. "David, please move," I said. "I'm leaving, and tomorrow I'm going to the police, and you can't stop me. The only thing you can control now is how you handle this, whether you make things worse by doing something stupid or whether you accept responsibility for your choices and try to minimize the damage." We stood there facing each other for what felt like an eternity, and I saw him warring with himself, saw the moment when he realized that threatening me or stopping me would only make things worse, would add domestic violence or kidnapping charges to the legal nightmare he was already facing. He stepped aside, his shoulders slumping in defeat, and I grabbed my purse and my phone and walked out of that house, possibly for the last time as the person I'd been when I walked into it 12 years ago as a newlywed. I drove to Jennifer's house that night, my hands shaking so badly I probably shouldn't have been driving, calling her from the road to tell her I was coming, that I'd confronted David, that everything was in motion now. She was waiting up for me when I arrived, and I collapsed into her arms in her doorway, finally allowing myself to break down, to cry for everything I was losing, the marriage I'd believed in, the intact family my children deserved, the innocence and trust I'd never get back. We stayed up most of that night, Jennifer helping me organize my evidence, making sure I had everything I needed to present a clear and comprehensive case to the police, helping me prepare for the questions they would ask and the scrutiny I would face. She kept assuring me I was doing the right thing, the brave thing, the only thing I could do under the circumstances, but it didn't feel brave or right. It felt like I was detonating a bomb that would destroy everything in its blast radius, my children's sense of security, their relationship with their father, possibly even my own freedom if investigators decided I should have known or reported this sooner. Saturday morning, Jennifer drove me to the police station, staying with me as I requested a meeting with a detective in the Drug Enforcement Unit. I brought copies of all my evidence, organized into folders with printed photos and screenshots, financial records, location information, everything I'd gathered over the past 6 weeks. The detective who met with us was a woman named Detective Sarah Rodriguez, and she listened to my story with professional attention, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me talk, letting me unload this enormous secret I'd been carrying. When I finished and showed her the evidence, I saw her expression change from routine interest to serious concern, and she excused herself for a few minutes, returning with 2 other detectives and someone from the prosecutor's office. They explained that what I'd described and the evidence I'd provided indicated a significant criminal operation, that they would need to investigate further, but that based on what I was telling them, they would likely be executing search warrants on our home and the storage unit very soon, probably within the next 24 to 48 hours. They asked me dozens of questions over the next several hours, about David's schedule and habits, about who else might be involved, about whether I felt I was in immediate danger, about whether he had access to weapons, which I disclosed, about whether he might flee if he suspected the authorities were investigating. They were professional and respectful, treating me as a cooperating witness rather than a suspect, which was a relief, but didn't make the experience any less emotionally exhausting. They assured me that my children and I would be protected, that they would coordinate the timing of any arrests to minimize trauma to my kids, that they would work with child services to ensure Emma and Jacob had appropriate support through this process. By the time I left the police station that afternoon, I felt hollowed out, emptied of everything but a kind of numb exhaustion, the adrenaline that had sustained me through the past 6 weeks finally depleting, leaving me barely functional. Jennifer took me back to her house, and I called Margaret to check on the kids, making an excuse about why I couldn't pick them up yet, asking if they could stay one more night. Please, something had come up with David's work. She was gracious about it, mentioning that the kids were having a wonderful time anyway, and I was grateful that they were far away from whatever was about to happen. I tried to call David several times that evening, not because I wanted to talk to him, but because I thought I should warn him, should give him the opportunity to cooperate. But he didn't answer, his phone going straight to voicemail each time. Later, through the investigation, I would learn that he'd destroyed all 3 of the hidden phones right after I left Friday night, probably assuming I would go to the police, probably trying to eliminate evidence, not realizing I'd already photographed everything, that his attempts at damage control were too little, too late. The police executed their search warrants on Sunday morning, and Detective Rodriguez called me to let me know before I heard about it through other channels. They'd arrested David at our home without incident, taking him into custody on multiple charges, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and weapons violations. They'd seized everything from our house that might be evidence: computers, phones, documents, financial records, essentially turning our home into a crime scene. They'd also raided the storage unit, finding everything I'd documented and more. Apparently David had restocked since my visit, not knowing that his operation was about to be exposed. Detective Rodriguez told me I could return home in a day or 2 once they'd processed the scene, but warned me that the house would look very different. Drawers and closets emptied, items seized, the physical manifestation of how thoroughly my life had been turned upside down. The news broke that evening. Local media picking up the story of a suburban father arrested in a major drug trafficking operation, and although they didn't initially name David or our address, it was only a matter of time before neighbors and friends figured it out. My phone started ringing with calls from people I hadn't heard from in years, some offering support, others clearly just fishing for gossip or details they could share. I turned off my phone eventually, unable to deal with the attention, unable to explain what had happened when I barely understood it myself. Jennifer fielded calls from the media, declining all interview requests on my behalf, and helped me start the process of filing for divorce, of trying to protect what few assets wouldn't be seized by the government, of beginning to build a life separate from David and his crimes. I picked up Emma and Jacob from Margaret's house on Monday morning, and that conversation, telling my children that their father had been arrested, that he wouldn't be coming home for a long time, that he'd been involved in illegal activities, was the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life. I tried to frame it in age-appropriate terms, explaining that Daddy had made some very serious mistakes, that he'd broken important laws, that he would have to face consequences for his choices. Emma, at 7, had so many questions I couldn't fully answer, asking why Daddy would do bad things, asking if it was her fault somehow, asking when we could visit him. Jacob, only 4, didn't really understand, kept asking when Daddy was coming home, when we could play together again, and each question felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Margaret was devastated, unable to believe that her son had been living this double life, insisting there must be some mistake, some misunderstanding, and I had to show her some of the evidence, had to help her accept the reality of who David had become, or perhaps who he'd always been beneath the surface. The next few months were a blur of legal proceedings, divorce filings, asset seizures, media attention, and trying to help my children process what had happened to our family. David pleaded guilty as part of a plea agreement, facing 15 years in federal prison, and I attended his sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom, needing to see this final chapter close before I could begin to move forward. He made a statement to the court, apologizing for his crimes, acknowledging the harm he'd caused, claiming he'd lost sight of what was important. And when he finished, he looked back and found me in the courtroom. And for just a moment, I saw the man I'd married, vulnerable and broken and full of regret, But then they led him away in handcuffs, and that momentary connection was severed, and I walked out of that courthouse a free woman, legally and emotionally untethered from the person who'd betrayed everything we'd built together. The house was eventually seized by the government as proceeds of criminal activity, and I had to move Emma and Jacob into a small apartment, starting over with almost nothing. But I've discovered something important in this process of rebuilding from the ruins of my former life, that I'm stronger than I thought I was, that my children are more resilient than I gave them credit for, that sometimes the worst thing that can happen becomes the catalyst for necessary change. Emma is in therapy, processing her feelings about her father and the dissolution of our family, and she's doing remarkably well. Her teacher says she's still the same bright, enthusiastic student she's always been. Jacob has some behavioral issues that we're working through, and he asks about his father less frequently now, though bedtime is still hard when he misses the familiar routine of David reading him stories. We visit David in prison once a month, because despite everything he's done, he's still their father, and I want them to be able to make their own decisions about that relationship as they grow older. I've had to answer so many questions from family, friends, investigators, therapists, lawyers, everyone wanting to know how I didn't see the signs, how I lived with someone for over a decade without knowing about his criminal activities. And honestly, I've asked myself those same questions thousands of times. How did I miss it? Were there signs I ignored? Should I have known? And maybe there were small things, inconsistencies in his stories, unexplained absences, financial discrepancies I didn't question closely enough. But the truth is that David was exceptionally good at compartmentalizing, at keeping his two lives completely separate, at being the perfect husband and father while simultaneously running a criminal enterprise. The people who are the best at deception aren't the ones who seem sketchy or untrustworthy. They're the ones who seem completely normal, completely sincere, the ones you never suspect because they've perfected the art of appearing authentic while hiding their true nature. I've learned that trust, once broken on this fundamental level, can never be fully repaired, but that doesn't mean I'll never trust anyone again. It just means I trust differently now, more carefully, more completely aware that people are capable of maintaining elaborate deceptions for years if motivated to do so. I've learned that the life you think you have and the life you actually have can be two completely different things, and that sometimes the truth is hiding in plain sight, in the locked drawer you never question, in the storage unit you don't know exists, in the smile of someone you thought you knew completely. I've learned that doing the right thing often feels terrible, that sometimes there are no good choices, only less terrible ones, and that the courage to blow up your own life when necessary is one of the hardest forms of bravery there is. If you're watching this video and something in my story resonates with you, if you've noticed inconsistencies in your partner's behavior or found evidence of things you can't explain, I want you to know that it's okay to question, to investigate, to trust your instincts even when everyone around you says you're being paranoid or overreacting. I ignored my instincts for years, dismissing small doubts and inconsistencies because I wanted to believe in the life we'd built together, and by the time I couldn't ignore the evidence anymore, I'd wasted years living in a reality that wasn't real, married to a person who didn't exist. I'm not saying you should live in constant suspicion of everyone around you, but I am saying that blind trust, the kind of trust I gave David that allowed him to hide an entire criminal life from me, is dangerous and potentially destructive. I'm sharing this story not for sympathy or attention, but because I think there's value in talking openly about how deception works, how people hide secrets, how seemingly normal families can be harboring darkness that no one suspects. If my story helps even one person recognize warning signs in their own life, if it encourages someone to ask questions they've been afraid to ask, if it gives someone the courage to investigate their suspicions despite feeling guilty about invading privacy, then the pain of reliving all of this by telling my story will have been worth it. The truth was hiding inside my own home for years, and I was so focused on maintaining the appearance of a perfect family, so invested in believing what I wanted to believe, that I failed to see what was right in front of me until circumstance forced me to look. To everyone who's made it this far in my story, thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to hear what happened to me and my family, and I hope you'll leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or your own experiences if you've been through something similar, because I've learned that sharing these stories, connecting with others who understand, is part of the healing process. If this story affected you, please consider subscribing to this channel, because I'll be continuing to share my journey of rebuilding my life and helping my children heal from their father's betrayal. And I'll also be sharing resources and information about recognizing deception, protecting yourself legally and financially, and recovering from the kind of fundamental breach of trust that changes everything. Hit that like button if you think stories like mine need to be told, if you believe in the importance of truth and transparency, and if you support survivors of deception and betrayal in all its forms. The truth was hiding inside my own home, but once I found it, once I had the courage to face it and act on it, I discovered something even more important: that I was strong enough to survive the revelation, that my children were resilient enough to weather this storm, and that sometimes the complete destruction of your old life is necessary to build a new one that's based on truth rather than comfortable lies.